Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live with a video. Yes, as you can see, I have the Warrior O slung up in a Tachi mount. Since this is essentially, to me, a Hondachi style blade. Though, the observant among you will note that this is also more reminiscent of European to 18th century US cavalry saber kind of mountings. Which, as you can see, the sword does sway a bit, but my movements are not impeded by its swaying. Yes, it does smack against my thigh, but you're not going to get the kind of like rigid, held in place kind of security that you will with a gun holster, for example, unless I literally make something from leather or a combination of leather, wood, and steel. But this kind of mounting serves its purpose. Now, admittedly, it does have some downsides. The very astute among you will notice immediately what I mean when I'm about to say profile awareness. And that being that when you stand forward like I am now, the sword does not actually go outside of my side profile range. And what I mean by that is the outside, from the outside of my right shoulder to the outside of my left shoulder. It does not protrude past my shoulders. Meaning that it takes up no more space side to side than I do. Now, naturally when I stand perfectly forward as it is right now, it does jut out to the back. But that can be remedied simply by stepping my right foot forward where the blade is now realigned squarely in my profile. Now when I turn to this profile, you can see obviously that the sword juts out more. Now, the classic way of mounting a katana, and I say katana specifically, does drastically reduce how far the sword sticks out in this profile. Though, there is one thing about the US cavalry sabers and military sabers had that this sword does not, and that is the ability to be turned around like so. With the way I have this sword mounted, which is far more Tachi inspired than saber inspired, I cannot flip the blade around as the military manuals show. Now you may be wondering, well, I'll just unclip the back and then problem solved. But then, with how long this blade is, the tip starts to bounce on the ground. Same problem with an actual military saber. Now, yes, granted, the military sabers, when worn in this fashion were held by the opposite arm as the soldiers walked. And in some cases, you could actually unclip the back and clip it forward. Now this does solve the problem of the sword sticking out in this plane. But in this plane, the sword now takes up far more room. And truthfully speaking, most of the time, whenever you're around somebody, you will be facing them. Or if you're in a crowd, you will all be facing the same direction. Which this can help. But now you come to the problem of if you have to draw this quickly from said position. Now with me, it's not that big a deal because I am somewhat ambidextrous when it comes to wielding swords. I can use them in either hand with roughly the same amount of dexterity. Though, argumentatively, I am slower drawing with my left hand. And very astute among you will have realized, well, Outlaw, you could just flip it around, like so. And yes, this does alleviate both problems in this position. The problem with this position is that when I go to draw it, actually, I take that back. This might actually solve the problem entirely. Oh, never mind. Now I found the problem with it. And that is, if I have to run, as we just saw, when I bring my left leg forward, it pushes the sword up. And walking is no problem. But as we can see, the sword wants to shift back to its original position because the only thing keeping it in this position is my left leg. If I remove my left leg from the equation, we see that the sword wants to go back here. And this is why you don't really see a lot of complex means of securing a sword in history. Because the people in history that originally created the carrying methods for swords more than likely ran into the same problems I have just demonstrated. Which is why a system like this is pretty much the tried and true method. Now, also, if I wanted to increase the angle to which the sword hangs with this particular style of belt, which is actually a tool belt, I can just clip it onto the second set of holes, which does bring the hilt up and the tip of the scabbard down, essentially mitigating how much sticks out the back. And of course, if I wanted to or had to, I could always just hold it in my left hand. These are all solutions that were used in period. Plus, from this position, I can draw this sword much quicker than if I had to draw it up, because I am able to utilize not only the full length of my arm, but also I can step back using my hips to gain more distance. And what I mean by that is when I stand stationary like this, my hips are in line with my shoulders and everything, but when I step back, my hips go back as they are changing angle, presenting my forward right hip while my left hip goes back. And this is the same technique they use in period, where samurai would step back to draw their swords in tandem with pulling the scabbard back and flicking the blade out. And that works with longer swords. The problem is when you get into swords that fit the hands of someone like me, who has a particular borderline, I would say, fetish on big blades. And is also one of the major reasons why I believe we never really saw quick draw techniques take root in Europe. Not to say that you can't draw a long sword quickly, but that goes into the properties of European versus Japanese scabbards. European scabbards are very much more utilitarian than Japanese scabbards, and I'll explain why. European scabbards are essentially there for one purpose: keep you from cutting yourself with the sword and giving you a place to store it. Japanese scabbards have a whole lot more meticulous planning put into them. They're usually carved for that specific blade. You get a blade from a swordsmith, you send it off to the polisher, polisher does his work, sends the blade off to the scabbard maker makes the scabbard, then the scabbard sent off to a lacquer master, the lacquer master applies the lacquer, then the sword is sent off, then the scabbard is essentially done, unless you want more accoutrements and basically fanciness added to it. And the Japanese scabbard also has one other key difference, and that is in the mouth of the scabbard. Most traditional Japanese scabbards, if not all traditional Japanese scabbards, have a buffalo horn fitting at the mouth called the koiguchi. Or koigata, one of the two. My scabbard terminology is a little rusty. But what this does is it reinforces the mouth of the scabbard and also somewhat acts as a tightening agent. As wood has a tendency to expand and contract. Bone doesn't have that tendency. As bone dries, it contracts. And some horns are mostly made of bone, some are made of keratin, but it depends. I'm not entirely sure of the structure of a water buffalo's horn. But I digress. The ring helps to tighten the mouth of the scabbard, essentially trying to create a watertight seal. That's why you see in a lot of Japanese anime and characters where the swordsman pushes out the sword, you hear sometimes a pop or click sound added. That is to emphasize, like, the breaking of the seal of the sword. And this practice of pushing the blade out with your thumb was adopted because in some cases the fit could be too tight and you could have trouble drawing the blade as quickly as you would normally need it if you got into a situation where you had to draw it quickly. As I just demonstrated. The pushing of the thumb shaves off about 1 to 1/2 of a second. And in a sword fight, 1 to 1/2 of a second could mean the difference between your blade meeting your opponent's throat versus your opponent's throat meeting versus your opponent's blade meeting your throat. But yeah. The differences between European and Japanese scabbards are there, where Europe has always had a more utilitarian mindset. The Japanese have always had a more artistic mindset when it came to their swords. And the subsequent accoutrements that came with the blades. Though, I will say this. If, let's say we were in the medieval era, 15th century Europe, 15th century Japan, I feel like it would be a lot easier, say, if you came back from a battle, your sword was still functional, like, it received minimum damage. The blade received minimum damage in the battle. Nothing that you couldn't polish out with a whetstone or a grinder's wheel. But your scabbard got broke. I feel like you would have a far easier time finding a replacement scabbard for a European sword than you would a Japanese sword. Especially considering that in Europe there were guilds for everything. So I feel like if you were to go to a swordmaker's guild, or even if I don't know if there were specific guilds for scabbards, but if there was a scabbard guild, and you went there, and you showed them the sword, I feel like it would be similar to today, where they would just go into a storeroom, slide the blade into some pre-made scabbards, find one that fits well enough, and sell it to you. In Japan, however, you have to go through, if you broke your scabbard, you'd have to go through the whole laborious process of having a new one made. Or, depending on if you had the money or not, you could always try a Shirasaya mount, where the scabbard is unadorned, it doesn't have lacquer, it doesn't have a koigata or anything else. It's literally just a wooden tube to hold the sword. Personally speaking, if I was a 15th century samurai and my scabbard broke, I would go with the plain wood option, because then it kind of gives me the chance to, like, customize it myself, or save money because I'm not having it lacquered or anything. I'm just literally getting this thing to do one job, and that's keep my sword intact, especially considering that the 15th century Japan was bordering the end of the Sengoku era, kind of teetering towards the Edo period, or the Tokugawa shogunate. Last century of true samurai. Anyone who watched my channel knows Outlaw has a particular disdain for Edo period samurai. I've said it before and I'll say it again. If I took a samurai from the middle of the 14th century, dead-ass center of the Sengoku era, and pitted him up against a 17th century Edo period samurai, no contest, he'd win 10 out of 10. But this is the video I promised to show this mounting system. I know I haven't really much talked about the mounting system itself. And that's because of just how simplistic it is. But before this video ends, I will actually give a close-up if I can get the damn thing unhooked. Holy shit, 20 minutes. Alright. So the system is really quite simplistic. Simple gutted paracord, braided and tied for strength and fancy look. I did use 4 strands in this braid, by the way. Tied and secured to these swivel hooks. These particular ones are called tiger jaws. You could use traditional ones if you wanted, or the ones that look like a hook with a little slidey clamp as well. But I got the materials from Menards. Overall, for the entire suspension setup, the paracord, the hooks, and even the tool belt, which argumentatively, aside from the paracord, is the cheapest part, you're looking to about $20, $30 all said for the entire setup like I have on this sword. But at the end of the day, $30 for a full functioning sword setup that you can customize out the hell. Basically choose whatever parts you want. And is so readily available at pretty much any hardware store, I would say is a fairly decent bargain. Especially considering that in most cases this setup won't harm like the lacquer or the finish on the scabbard. Meaning that you don't have to worry about scuffing or scratching or denting your swords by having full metal fittings put onto them. Now, I may also do a more in-depth video on just the assembly of these. Like, go over how I assembled them at a later date. And like I said, simple leather tool belt. Nothing fancy, nothing outside of the realm of a budget, especially if, let's say, you bought a very expensive sword, but it doesn't have any kind of means of securing it to your belt, aside from just slipping it into the scabbard. I know big time perpetrators of this are Dark Sword Armory, where Dark Sword Armory gives you the option if you want an integrated sword belt or not, but that's an extra $100 off the top. Albion is the biggest one because they make the swords and then they ship the swords to you, but the swords don't have scabbards with them. You have to order the scabbard separately, which is the biggest fucking load of bullshit ever. If you're going to make a fucking sword, you need to include a scabbard or at least a leather sheath. Something to store the blade in. I don't know how many complaints Albion must have had about that over the years. Also, Cold Steel. They sell European-style blades, but they don't give you any kind of ability to hook the sword to your scabbard. I mean, hook the scabbard to your belt. I think on the competition cutting sword they do, and their German longsword. But aside from them, not really. Let's see here. Ronin Katana, I've heard all kinds of shit about them, but they at least do give you an integrated sword belt on some of their weaponry. I've seen reviews of the belts not being the absolute best quality, but at least they're there. So props to them for at least taking that into consideration. But let me know what you think down in the comments below, my noble band of outlaws. Because, especially, like I said, on really expensive swords that don't come with any kind of mounting system, this in itself could be extremely cost effective. Truthfully, it doesn't look the absolute best. I'll grant that. This is very Spartan, redneck, more sellsword mercenary type of suspension than a properly integrated sword belt would be. But this is very much for if you're on a budget and you've already bought like one decent expensive sword that you don't want to just slip through your belt and take the chance of your belt rubbing and scraping and basically taking the finish off. At this point, I'm not really concerned about that because I've refinished this scabbard so many times. Like I said, cold steel scabbards, the lacquer on them is a joke. It's thin as paper. The scabbard is decent, but it's thin as paper. I have literally considered just covering this whole thing in a layer of epoxy and seeing how that goes. Once I kind of redo it for the next time, once spring and summer gets here, fill in the cracks and shit. But like I said, let me know what you think down in the comments below, and until next time, my noble band of outlaws, Outlaw Samurai tells all y'all be crazy rednecks, be safe and use your weapons. I'm out. Peace.